Hi all, we saw another very exciting game in the World Championship match in game 6. Anand playing white kicked off with d4 and Kramnik played knight f6, and after c4 we saw e6. So, in this game Anand played knight c3, not minding the pin on his knight. After bishop b4 he varied though, he didn't play f3 like in a previous game, he played actually queen c2, so a little bit more main line perhaps. I think this is one of Kasparov's favourite moves against the Nimzo Indian. After d5, Anand plays c takes d5, and now Kramnik plays queen takes d5. So with this move, Kramnik is emphasising that he wants to have piece pressure on these central squares, and perhaps later, get a rook to d8. In return, white has some piece pressure on the c file. So both sides have their semi-open file now. Black the semi-open d file, white the semi-open c file. After knight f3, queen f5 was played. So it seems to be quite a controversial move because, the double pawns, do they look really bad? Well, let's have a quick look. If white had taken, this would actually be okay for black, I believe, because, black's emphasising control of the e4 square by having that pawn on f5. So I think this kind of variation would be fine. So in the game, Anand decided to avoid the exchange of queens and didn't want black emphasising that e4 square. He played queen b3. So what has to be done with the bishop? Either retreat, take on c3 or protect it. Well, Kramnik decided to protect it with knight c6, also exerting a little bit of pressure on d4. And white now unpins the knight with bishop d2. And after castles, white now decides to try and harass the queen and gain a little bit of space on the king side by playing move h3. So it prepares g4, kicking that queen away. After b6 though, potentially white's position is a little bit awkward on this diagonal. If there's a bishop on b7, this rook is going to be a tactical vulnerability. So white's aware of that. He does play g4 anyway, and after queen a5, he plays actually just rook c1. So with rook c1, he's potentially, exerting more pressure on this c file and preparing a3 as well. So he could recapture potentially after bishop takes c3 with rook takes c3 if he wanted. But after bishop b7 a3, he actually recaptures with the bishop. So bishop takes c3, attacking that queen again. And after queen d5, now white actually accepts the exchange of queens. So are we in for a dull game just because the queens have come off? Well, actually no, there's plenty of play left in the position as the game shows. After knight takes d5, bishop d2, there's a battle of piece pressure now and the c and d files. So after knight f6, black's immediately threatening things like knight takes d4. So white does something about that because of this diagonal, this pressure on the rook potentially on h1. The rook moves to g1. And after rook ac8, a bit of a prophylactic move, defending against c7 so that the knight can move, and maybe black can play c5 later to try and liberate the position. White just plays bishop g2, and now knight e7 is played. And perhaps this is a little bit controversial because, was this gambit that sound which Kramnik now goes into? After bishop b4, he didn't really want to passively defend the knight. He actually gambited a pawn. But let's have a look. Say he had defended it. Now here, maybe white can get an advantage with, maybe either bishop takes e7 or knight e5. So let's have a look at knight e5, for example. This kind of position, with now bishop takes e7 as a Zwischenzug. Now if the bishop moves, then bishop takes f6 is going to be good. And say rook takes e7, then this kind of position, there's still a little bit of pressure for white, nagging pressure on that c file and the c7 pawn. So this kind of variation, and if the other rook can coordinate with its friend on the queen side, then this is going to be great for white. If that rook to g3 to c3 can happen, then black's going to be under much more pressure on that c7 pawn. So basically, in the game, after bishop b4, Kramnik did something quite controversial. He did a gambit with c5, and Anand actually just accepted the gambit and didn't mind, a seemingly very, passive position at some point, with black's pieces seemingly springing to life. So very aggressive black knights now, and white's having to defend with precision. So knight d3, defending that from rook c1 check, the black coming in. After knight d5, now bishop d2, and even allowing, the seemingly useful rook on the 7th rank. But white is material up here, a pawn up, a solid pawn up. If he can just hold on to his pawns and kick the knights back. And we see that now. The knights are going to be kicked back from their aggressive positions. So white seems to be really on the defensive here. But if white can get in f3 and e4, the tables will be turning here in terms of the visual appearance of the position. Kramnik unleashes f5 though, so he's still, playing very aggressively, trying to move all his pieces and pawns forward into the opponent's territory. But now just king d1, and after rook c8, now f3. So the eviction begins of these, seemingly aggressive knights. After knight d6, now another quiet move, believe it or not, and the king's just come from e1. But these grandmasters, they play the position; they don't play based on what they played previously. King e1, so the king returns to e1. So it's done its job for the moment there now, and wants to return there. So after a5, e3 is played. And, what is black doing here? Actually, Kramnik now played another committal decision, sacrificing another pawn temporarily to try and get his knights aggressive again. He played e5, and after g takes, he played e4. So again, we see the return of these seemingly very aggressive knights. But this comes at some price. There's a potential pawn mass building up now. These two pawns, are potentially quite dangerous if they can ever be liberated. And Anand shows that they can. He first plays bishop d2, and after a4, it seems this is a nice positional move in its own right, clamping down on the b pawn. So is white passive here? Well, actually, white can untangle now, and the starting move is knight f2. So it drives one of the knights back, and after knight d6, now rook g4. So again, this is quite an aggressive move, attacking that vulnerability, that poor a pawn, forcing black into another committal decision that he really doesn't want. He actually plays knight c4. And one of the things about knight c4 is these pawns can start to get into motion and be accelerated. If white's not too concerned about protecting b2, he can actually sacrifice b2 and get those pawns to be really aggressive to win material in their own right. So e4 now is played, and we see the pawns marching forward. So after knight f6, white's prepared to sacrifice the b2 pawn, because after rook g3, knight takes b2, the pawns march forward with e5. So this seems, is this a bit weakening? Because, what if the pawn was pinned with rook e8? Well, actually, there's bishop c3 here, apparently. And after, say, knight c4, then e6. And this is very, very dangerous for black. Look at the king position, that the knight pinned. What is black doing here? So, in fact, black's potentially losing a piece. So say knight d6, well, maybe, bishop takes f6 is not so good because the knight takes f5. But here, apparently knight g4, and this would be very strong. So if knight g4 hg, and white has a very strong mass of pawns, so that would be a clear advantage for white. So basically, these pawns are going forward quite aggressively now. And after knight d5, so f6 was played. So they're starting to win material in their own right. White's fretting now, rook takes g7 and fg, and also maybe knight e4 and f7 and all sorts of nasties. So actually black played king f7, and after knight e4, the immediate threat is knight d6, so forking the rook and the king. And black defended the d6 square with knight c4, but now white played f takes g7. Now a lot of people believe, and engines seem to believe, that rook takes g7 is stronger. Let's have a quick look. So this kind of continuation shows how dangerous the f pawn is in some variations. So, but f takes g7 as played by Anand is also very strong, because after rook d3, the rook's threatening to come to the 7th rank, and look at the white pieces, they're much more aggressive than before, and the knights are still being driven back from their former, seemingly aggressive glory days. They're now being forced into this defensive posture. After bishop h6, now knight takes e5 is played. So it seems for the moment black's almost restoring material equality. Just one pawn down, but now we see after knight f6 that the g pawn is a decisive tactical element in its position, because after king f7 there's a very, very nice decoy move which I hope you can see. So trying to liberate this pawn to become a queen. What would you play here? I'll give you 5 seconds starting from now. Okay, the move Anand played was rook c3, so a nice decoy. The rook can't be taken to g8, queening. So, but actually that was what was played. Indeed, rook takes c3 was played, and after g8 queening, king takes f6. There's a small matter now of material balance. So bishop g7 check, and unfortunately, the king and the rook will be on the skewering line. So, for example, if the king moved, well, actually, in this position, let me say that black actually had enough here. Black resigned. But say, you know, Kramnik had played on with king f5, then there's all sorts of strong moves. In fact, you know, queen takes h7 might be technically stronger than bishop takes e5. But bishop takes e5 is the clearest to understand because of this skewer. So basically, this skewer, and that's it. So I hope you enjoyed this game. Please leave any comments on YouTube. Thanks very much.